The name shouldn't have been spoken, not here, not now. Yet the forest whispered it anyway, as if something unseen stood between the pines and breathed it into the snow. Nerith. The sound rippled outward like a stone dropped into deep black water, repeating, not echoing, but remembering her. Branches shivered, though there was no wind. The aurora thinned into a narrow green vein across the sky, pulsing like a heartbeat she could not deny. The name felt ancient, ceremonial, something meant for the dead, not the living. And when it reached her, the world seemed to hold its breath. She froze as if the word had been a hand pressed to her sternum. The rune at her throat tightened under linen, a cold band that made breath catch. For a moment, she could not move. The old name, her name before the river had rewritten her, sat in her mouth like a coin she had never meant to spend. Shame and something older than shame folded into her like a winter cloak. The sound of her own heart seemed too loud, a drum that betrayed the ledger beneath her skin. He saw the change in her as if it were a weather shift. The way her shoulders drew up, the way her fingers curled at the edge of her cloak, the small, involuntary tilt of her head, each motion read like a map of pain. He stepped closer without thinking, a motion that had become second nature. A man who had learned to be a wall. His hand found the haft of his spear, and then her wrist, not to bind, but to anchor. The contact was a tether. The warmth of his palm against her skin was a small, human defiance against the cold ledger that had named her. The hunter watched them both with an unnatural stillness, as if he were a stone that had learned to breathe. He had the look of someone who had spent years listening to currents and names, who had learned to read the river's grammar in the way reeds bent. His eyes were dark and patient, and when he spoke, his voice was low and dry as driftwood. He did not hurry the moment. He let the name hang between them like a verdict. The forest seemed to lean in with him, the pines holding their needles like fingers. The name was a key, and everyone in the hush knew it. It was not merely a label, but a hinge on which the ledger turned. When the river had returned her, it had given her a new name and stitched a seam into her flesh. The old name had been folded away like a page in a book. To hear it spoken by another was to feel the seam tug. The rune at her throat answered the echo with a flare so quick it made the carvings along the cave's memory seem to shiver. The priestess's marks, reed crowns, hands cupped to water, ledgers balanced on stone, seemed to lean toward the sound, as if to read the margins. He tightened his grip on her wrist, not to stop her from moving, but to keep her from being swept by the tide of memory. The motion was small and fierce. He had learned to read danger in the way snow lay on branches, and in the way a name could make a woman fold. The promise he had made in the cave, soft and absolute, sat between them like a shield. He did not speak the name back. He did not need to. His silence was a vow. The hunter's stillness was a kind of pressure. He stepped forward a fraction, and the air changed, as if a ledger had been opened. "Names are doors," he said, and the sentence was a blade wrapped in a riddle. "They are keys, and they are traps. The river gives names like coins, and the dead king keeps accounts." His words were not accusation so much as observation. He spoke as one who had watched the river balance its books for years. She pressed her palm to her throat as if to hold the rune in place. The old name, Nerith, felt like a seam that might split open if pulled. Shame rose first, hot and private. then fear braided with a fierce, stubborn pride. She had bargained with the river to bring back a life. She had paid in pieces of herself and in a name that belonged to another world. The thought that the ledger might be read aloud by men who kept accounts made her want to hide in the snow and never be found. He watched her, with a look that was both tenderness and a soldier's calculation. He had seen the cost of bargains in the river's wake, the way a man's hands could be steady and still hold a memory that would not leave him. He wanted to promise her everything, and knew promises were fragile in a world that kept accounts. Instead, he tightened his hold, let his shoulder press against her, and let the silence be the vow. The hunter's eyes did not leave her face. He had the patience of someone who had waited for a name to be spoken, and for the ledger to show its margins. He reached into his cloak and produced a scrap of reed work, a charm that smelled of peat and old prayers. He did not offer it. He let it hang between them like a token. "The river does not simply return," he said, voice low as a current. "It rewrites. It makes seams and gates. Names are the hinges." The words landed like stones. The rune at her throat pulsed in answer. A bell struck in a distant hall. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The name had been a key. Now the hunter turned it in the lock. He stepped closer, so near that the breath between them fogged the air, and his voice dropped to a whisper that threaded through the trees. "I know what you truly are," he said, and the sound was not wind, but a verdict. The hunter's voice cut the hush like a blade. He did not hurry the revelation. He let each word fall as if it were a coin placed on a ledger. "You are not cursed to hell," he said, and the sentence rearranged the air. "You are bound by a bargain you made with the river, out of love." The confession landed between them, heavy and precise, and the forest seemed to lean in to hear the accounting. The rune at her throat answered, as if the words had been a summons. Cold flared under linen, a white flare that felt like a hand pressed to the inside of her skin. Pain lanced along the seam where the river had stitched itself into her flesh. Memory unspooled in quick, jagged flashes. Black water, a fevered room, the small, hot weight of a child's chest against her palms. A voice that was not human offering terms in the hush. Each image was a coin counted and a debt recorded. She pressed her fingers to the mark as if to hold the pieces together, but the touch only made the ledger louder. He watched her with a look that was both pity and a soldier's calculation. The hunter's eyes did not soften. They catalogued. "You bargained for life," he said. "You gave the river a name and a promise. It took a seam and it left you with a hinge. That hinge is the rune." His voice was low and dry as driftwood, the tone of someone who had read contracts in the dark and learned how to weigh their clauses. "It is not hell's whim that holds you. It is the terms you offered when you were desperate." Einar's jaw tightened. He had stood between ledgers and lives before, but this was a different accounting, one written in water and memory. "What do you mean, bargain?" he asked, voice taut. The question was practical, a soldier's attempt to turn mystery into geometry. He stepped closer, the motion a shield. The spear in his hand was a blunt, honest thing. His stance said he would not be moved by riddles. The hunter's face was a map of patience. "You offered a name," he said. "Names are currency to the river. You gave it a name that belonged to another world, and it gave you back a life in exchange. But the river keeps its books. It will call for balance." The words were not accusation so much as ledger reading. The mark can be broken. There are ways to unwrite a seam, but every unwriting has a cost. The rune flared at the mention of cost, a white drumbeat that made the air taste of iron. Memory flashed again, hands cupped to black water, a voice that promised return and then stitched a seam into flesh. The pain was a geography she had learned to navigate, a bruise that sometimes sang, a bell that sometimes tolled. She had borne the ledger like a private weather, and now the hunter named the terms aloud. Einar's eyes narrowed. "What cost?" he demanded. The question was a blade wrapped in a plea. He had already promised to stand between her and the world. He had not promised to be the coin in a ledger. The thought of a price, of what might be asked, made his hands clench. He had seen what bargains did to men. They hollowed them, made them small and careful. He would not let that happen to her if he could help it. The hunter's answer was a slow, terrible thing. "There are 3 ways," he said. 1. The river may be paid in life for life. The life you took could be returned, another life given in its place. 2. The name may be given back, willingly, by the one who bears it. The bride could speak the river name and unmake the seam, but she would lose what the river gave: memory, warmth, the part of herself that the bargain rewove. 3. Another may offer themselves in her stead, speak the name and take the ledger's tally. He let each option hang like a coin on the table. The rune answered each possibility with a different ache. The thought of returning the life she had saved made her stomach drop, as if the river had reached in and taken the air. The idea of speaking the river name herself, of unmaking what the bargain had made, felt like cutting out a piece of her own heart. The notion that another might take her place made her hands clench around his cloak. Each option was a ledger entry that demanded a signature. Einar's face went hard. "No one will take her place," he said, the vow a low, dangerous thing. The words were not bravado. They were a line drawn in the snow. He had already chosen to be the wall between her and the world. The hunter's eyes flicked to him, measuring the promise like a man who reads the weight of a coin. "You speak as if you can choose for the river," the hunter said. "You cannot. The ledger answers to its own logic. It will accept only what is offered freely." His voice was a caution. "If the one who loves her speaks the river name, the ledger will take its due. If she speaks it, she pays in herself. If another speaks it, they may be taken instead. The river does not bargain with force." The forest seemed to hold its breath. Snow fell in a hush that made the world feel like a page waiting for ink. The rune at her throat pulsed. A bell struck in a distant hall, and the memory flashes came faster. Hands, water, a child's laugh swallowed by night. Shame and love braided in her chest. The ledger's margins were full of things she had not wanted to name. Beneath their boots, the ground trembled, a low animal shudder that ran through roots and stone. The trees shivered as if something ancient had shifted in its sleep. The hunter's jaw tightened. His eyes went distant, listening to a current. Only he seemed to hear. The ledger had been named. The river had been addressed. Now the world answered. Something old and patient stirred beneath them. The valley woke like a mouth opening after a long sleep, and echoes rose from its ribs like voices calling from old lives. Sound folded into sound. A child's laugh, the scrape of a cart, a woman's prayer, all layered and thin as ice. The air itself seemed to remember footsteps it had not heard in years. and the trees repeated those memories back in a chorus that made the skin along the neck prickle. They had to cross before night swallowed the light. The hunter's warning had been plain. This place revealed what you feared most, and the valley's appetite for truth was patient and precise. They moved with the urgency of people who know how quickly a landscape can turn from refuge to trap. Snow underfoot crunched like brittle paper. Breath came in white ghosts that the wind tried to steal. Echoes threaded the pines and the low hollows, replaying fragments of lives, as if the land were a ledger, and every moment a line to be read aloud. At first the sounds were small, an old song hummed by a woman who had once mended nets, the clink of a spoon. But then the valley turned its voice inward, and the echoes sharpened into scenes. Her memories rose like glass, a fevered night by a black river, hands cupped to water, the boy's small chest under her palms, the river's hush that promised return in a voice that was not human. The bargain unspooled in flashes, the smell of peat and iron, the taste of coin on a tongue, the seams sewn into flesh. Each echo was a mirror that showed a different angle of the same wound. The rune at her throat answered the valley's chorus with a cold that made her fingers go numb. The mark pulsed like a bell struck in a distant hall, and the pain that came with it was a geography she had learned to navigate alone. He watched her as the echoes played, and the sight of her memory made something in him ache. The hunter's words, names are doors, bargains are ledgers, had not been a riddle, but a map. Now the valley read that map aloud. When a laugh from a long-ago summer rose, and then folded into the sound of water swallowing breath, her shoulders drew up, and she looked smaller, as if the world had taken a bite out of her. He stepped closer without thinking, the motion a shield. His hand found the small of her back and held, a human anchor against the tide of memory. The hunter walked beside them with the stillness of someone who has learned to listen to currents. He had warned them at the ridge, "The valley will show you the truth you fear most." He had not said whether that truth would free or bind. Now, as echoes braided through the trees, he watched with a patience that felt like a weighing. "It will not lie," he said once, voice low and dry. "It will only show. You must choose what to do with what you see." The sentence was a ledger opened and left on the snow. They crossed hollows where the echoes were thickest. A child's voice, bright, unguarded, replayed a memory of a hand that had once been warm and then gone. The sound hit her like a physical thing. She staggered, and he steadied her, fingers pressing into the hollow of her waist. The contact was small and fierce, a promise without words. The closeness between them deepened not in a single grand gesture, but in a string of these mercies, hands that steadied, breath that matched breath, the way his shoulder became a place to lean. Under the pressure of the valley's revelations, their intimacy grew like a plant pushing through frost. Echoes did not spare him either. A night of orders and a riverbank where he had failed to hold a hand. Those images rose and made his jaw harden. He did not flinch from the mirror the valley held up. Instead, he let the memory make him steadier for her. When an echo replayed the sound of men shouting and a body slipping into black water, his fingers tightened on the haft of his spear, as if to hold the past from repeating. The valley showed both of them what they had tried to bury, and in that shared exposure, something like trust took root. At times the echoes were mercifully vague, a scent, a half-remembered tune. But then the valley sharpened, and the past became a room with its doors open. She saw herself younger before the river's seam, laughing with a hairpin in her hand, the sound of her own voice bright and unscarred. The memory was a blade and a balm at once. It made her want to fold into that girl and never leave. He watched the change in her face and felt the fierce, foolish urge to gather all her broken pieces and make them whole. The hunter's warning threaded through the hush like a seam. "This place will show you the truth you fear most," he repeated, and the words were not cruel, but precise. "It will not tell you what to do. It will only make the ledger legible." The valley's echoes were a ledger that demanded reading. The act of crossing it was a choice to look at the margins. Each step forward was a decision to face what the river had written into them. As the light thinned and the shadows lengthened, the echoes grew more intimate, as if the valley had learned to speak in private. A lullaby she had sung once to a fevered child rose, and then folded into the sound of water. The rune at her throat pulsed in time with the echo, and the pain that came with it was a reminder that memory had a price. He pressed his forehead to hers for a breath, the contact a benediction and a vow. The world narrowed to the press of skin, and the sound of their breathing braided with the valley's chorus. Then, from the hollow ahead, an echo answered the hunter's warning with a voice that made the air still. It spoke in her own tone, the clear, unscarred voice she had before the river took her, and the sound was a small, impossible thing. "Nerith," it said, and the syllable fell like a bell. Her own voice rose from the air around her, clear, younger, the sound of a woman before the river rewrote her. It did not come from her lips, but from the valley itself, as if the hollow had learned to imitate memory. "Nerith," the echo sang, and the syllable was a small, bright thing that cut the cold. The sound carried the shape of a life she had been, the cadence of laughter that had not yet been folded into ledger terms. For a moment, the world narrowed to that voice, and the ache it opened. The echo did not stop at a name. It unfolded like a page, a fevered night, a small chest rising and falling, the smell of peat and sweat, hands cupped to black water. The valley spoke the bargain as if it were reading from a ledger left in the snow. She had knelt by a river that took and gave in the same breath. She had offered herself because the life she loved, someone small and warm and utterly human, was slipping away. The river answered with a seam, a name taken, a life returned, a part of her stitched into the current. The bargain had been made out of love, not malice, and the valley said it plainly. The rune at her throat flared as the memory unspooled, a white flare that felt like a hand pressed to the inside of her ribs. Pain lanced along the seam where the river had sewn itself into her flesh. Images came in jagged flashes, water closing over a face, a voice that was not human whispering terms. The cold of a bargain struck in the dark. She pressed her palm to the mark as if to hold the pieces together, but the touch only made the ledger louder. Shame and a fierce, private grief broke open in her like thin ice. He moved to her as if pulled by a rope. The motion was immediate and unthinking, a man who had learned to be a wall. His arms closed around her in a way that was both shelter and confession. She let herself fold into him. The small of her back pressed to his chest, and the contact steadied the tremor that ran through her. He did not speak the words that crowded the air. He did not need to. His hand at the base of her skull, the press of his palm against her hair, said what vows could not yet be trusted to hold. The closeness between them deepened in the hush that followed the valley's revelation. It was not a sudden, dramatic consummation, but a string of small, dangerous mercies. A thumb that wiped a tear she had not meant to shed, a forehead pressed to hers in a benediction, a near whisper that hovered on the edge of confession. He let his voice be a low thing against her ear. "You did what love asks," he said, and the sentence was both absolution and a vow. She answered with a look that held both apology and a plea, not to be judged for the ledger she carried. Their intimacy felt forbidden, because the bargain itself was a kind of theft, life taken from one place and given in another, and because the world kept accounts that did not forgive. Yet, under the pressure of the valley's echoes, their bond became a small rebellion. He tightened his arms around her, as if to make a private world where the ledger could not reach. She leaned into him, letting the warmth of his body be a counterweight to the cold that had been siphoned from her veins. The rune at her throat pulsed in time with their breathing. A bell struck in a distant hall, and each pulse took a small piece of her like a toll. Night fell with a speed that felt like a decision. Shadows lengthened, and the valley's echoes grew hungry, replaying not only what had been, but what might be. The hunter's silhouette moved like a patient thing at the edge of the trees, listening to the currents the way a man listens for the sound of a net. He had warned them that the valley would show the truth one fears most. Now the truth had been named, and the ledger's margins were visible. The air tightened as if the world itself were drawing a breath before a verdict. They pressed on because the path demanded motion. Standing still would let the valley read them until there was nothing left to hide. Snow underfoot turned to a crust that cracked like old paper. Echoes braided with the wind, lullabies and cries, the scrape of a cart, the soft syllable of a name she had never meant to speak aloud. Each sound was a mirror that showed a different angle of the bargain she had made. She stumbled once, the motion small and human, and he steadied her with a hand at her elbow. The touch was a vow. "I will not let the ledger take you alone." Danger rose like a tide. The ground beneath their boots began to tremble, a low, animal shudder that ran through roots and stone. The valley answered the movement with a chorus of falling leaves and the distant crack of something ancient shifting. The hunter's face went still, listening to a current only he seemed to hear. He did not speak. His silence was a weighing. The rune at her throat flared, a white drumbeat that made the air taste of iron, and the memory flashes came faster, hands, water, a child's laugh swallowed by night. Then the earth gave a long, terrible sigh. A ridge of snow collapsed ahead of them, with the sound of a rib snapping. The ground opened like a mouth, and the path they had been following slid away, sending them stumbling toward a dark seam in the earth. The valley's voice rose into a keening that was part wind and part ledger, and the world tilted. They fell together, the press of bodies and breath, and the cold of the rune against his palm, and were forced toward a hidden subterranean river that ran beneath the valley like a secret kept too long. The hidden path opened onto a dark seam of water that did not mirror the world but remembered it. Moonlight fell into the subterranean hollow, and the river answered with images instead of reflections. Scenes unspooled across the black glass like film. Hands cupping water, a fevered room lit by a single guttering lamp, a small chest rising and falling, a face blurred by panic. The surface did not show them as they were now, It showed what had been written into the current, the ledger of moments the river kept. Soundless images slid and overlapped until the whole hollow thrummed with the weight of memory. She saw the true moment the river had marked her, as if the water were reading aloud the ledger she had tried to hide. The film on the surface tightened to a single night, a child's fever, the smell of peat and sweat, a mother's hands that shook, the river's edge black and patient. She saw herself kneel, cupping the small body, feeling the life slip like a coin from a trembling palm. The river's voice, low, patient, not wholly human, offered terms in a hush that tasted of iron. She saw the seam sewn into her flesh, a touch like cold fire along her throat, a name given in a voice that was not hers, and the world rearranging itself around the bargain. The memory was not accusation, but a ledger entry, precise and terrible. He watched the river's film with a look that broke something open in him. The images made the ledger visible. The bargain struck out of love. The desperate hands, the price paid in a name. He saw the way her shoulders had folded under the weight of that night, the way she had carried the seam like a private weather. The sight of her sacrifice, so small, so human, made his chest ache with a tenderness that had nothing to do with duty. He stepped closer until the heat of his shoulder warmed the chill at her collarbone. The motion was a vow without words. They did not speak much. Words would have been clumsy in the hollow, where the river spoke in images. Instead, they let the river show, and let their bodies answer. He reached for her, and his hand found the rune at her throat, as if to feel the seam beneath the linen. The contact was electric and gentle. She flinched, and then leaned into him, letting the warmth of his palm be a counterweight to the cold that had been siphoned from her. The closeness between them deepened in the hush, an intimacy born of shared witness and the knowledge that the ledger had been written in a night of love, not malice. She told him, in a voice that was almost a whisper and almost a confession, what the river had taken and what it had given. The words were spare, the fever, the bargain, the name. He listened as if the world had narrowed to the sound of her breath. When she finished, the river's surface shifted and showed the small face she had saved, alive, laughing, in a later memory she had kept like a coin in a pocket. The sight made something in her both ache and soften. He pressed his forehead to hers, and the contact said what vows could not yet be trusted to hold. I see you. I will not let the ledger take you alone. The river did not stop at memory. As the images rolled, the water's hush changed into a voice that was older than the valley. It spoke not in syllables, but in the cadence of tides and ledgers, and the hollow answered with a low vibration that ran through stone and bone. The film on the surface rearranged itself and then stilled, as if the river had paused to weigh what it had shown. When it spoke, the sound was a ripple that touched the rune at her throat like a finger on a bell. You bargained, the river said without words, and the meaning was clear. You offered a name and took a life back. The ledger remembers. The seam can be unmade, but the books must balance. The images shifted to diagrams of exchange, names like coins, hands passing tokens, a seam being cut and a wound closing. The river's logic was not cruel, it was arithmetic. It kept accounts and accepted only what was offered freely. He asked the question she had not wanted to hear aloud. What would it take to break the seam? The river answered, with a clarity that made the hollow feel like a courtroom. The final requirement was not a riddle, but a condition. The river name must be spoken willingly to unmake the bargain. The act must be voluntary. The ledger would accept no theft. The river showed the three paths again, life for life, the bearer speaking the name and losing what the river had given, or another offering themselves in her stead. But now it framed the choice with a single, unavoidable truth. The unmaking required a willing voice. The film narrowed to a single image then, and the hollow went very still. The river leaned close as if to whisper, and the sound threaded through the air like cold silk. It did not shout the price. It let the image speak first, a hand releasing a name into the dark, a face folding like paper, warmth leaving a body like breath. Then the water's surface rippled, and the whisper came, soft as a current and terrible as law. The river told her what the ledger would take if she chose to speak the name herself. It did not speak of coin or blood, but of memory and of what made her human. The whisper slid across the hollow and touched the rune at her throat, and she felt it like a cold hand at the base of her skull. The river whispered the price she must pay. The river demanded its price like a thing that had been waiting for an answer since the world was young, an insistence that rose from the black glass and wrapped the hollow in a cold, patient voice. It did not shout. It counted. The surface showed the ledger of moments again, but now the images were a summons. The seam it had sown, the name it had taken, the life it had returned. The water's hush pressed against their ribs, and the rune at her throat answered with a bell that made the air taste of iron. She stepped forward as if pulled by the current of the memory itself. Her hands trembled, not with fear of death, but with the knowledge of what unmaking would mean. To speak the river name willingly was to cut a thread that had been woven into her flesh. It might be death, or dissolution, or the slow unmaking of the self the bargain had made. She folded her fingers into the linen at her throat and let the cold of the rune crawl under her skin. The choice had been laid bare: speak and pay, or refuse, and live with the ledger's teeth. He would not let her stand alone. He moved like a man who had learned to be a wall and a bridge at once, stepping into the river's hush, closing the small distance between them. His hand found hers, fingers threading through fingers, and the contact was a vow without words. He did not offer to bargain with the river's logic. He offered himself. The motion was simple and absolute. "I will not let you go," his eyes said, and the vow in his posture made the hollow answer with a low vibration that ran through stone and bone. She looked at him then, and in that look the ledger's margins shifted. The thing she had feared most, the river taking what she loved in payment, became a different geometry when placed beside the man who had chosen to stand with her. The thought of him speaking the name in her stead had been a temptation and a terror. The thought of both of them speaking it together was a different kind of sacrament. It would not be theft. It would be a gift offered freely, and the river accepted only what was given. They chose together. Their voices were small in the hollow, two threads braided into one. The name left their lips as a single sound, an offering and a key, and the river leaned in like a thing that had been waiting for the right coin. The water's surface shivered, and the images on it rearranged, not as accusation, but as ledger-making. The current reached up and touched the rune at her throat, and then the place where his palm rested on her hand, and the hollow filled with a light that was not warmth, but the sense of a balance being rewritten. The binding they made was not a theft of fate, but a joining of two lives into a single account. The river took what it had been owed, but it took it differently than it had expected. Instead of demanding a life, it accepted a shared seam, a braided tether woven from the willingness of two hearts. The rune's bell tolled once, a sound like a coin, struck, and then it cooled. The white flare that had lived under her linen unspooled into a thin, braided line that ran from her throat down her wrist and into the line that now marked his palm. Where the ledger had once had a single debtor, it now had two names written in the same hand. The cost was real. They felt it in the hollow of their chests, an ache like a small, honest grief. Memories shifted. The river's hold on her particular seam loosened, and some of the river's private language slipped away from her, like water through fingers. Not everything was lost. The child's laugh she had saved remained bright and whole. The warmth of the life she had bargained for stayed in the world. But the river's intimate, ledgered memories, the hush that had once been stitched into her nights, thinned. In exchange, a new thing grew, a shared memory that belonged to both of them, a seam that was not a debt, but a promise. He felt the change as if a piece of his own life had been braided into hers. The bargain did not take his breath. It took a small, steadying part of his solitude. Where once he had been a man who kept accounts in the language of orders, he now carried a tenderness that had weight. The mark on his palm was a reminder and a vow. He had chosen to be bound, and in choosing, he had altered the ledger's arithmetic. The river's voice receded like a tide that had been answered. The subterranean hollow stilled, the film on the water smoothed into a mirror that reflected not debts, but two faces lit by a single, quiet light. The rune's flare cooled into a faint, braided scar that glowed only when their hands touched. The hunter watched with the stillness of someone who had read many ledgers and seen how they could be rewritten. He did not speak. His silence was a benediction. They rose from the hollow together, the press of their bodies, a small, human warmth against the cold stone. Outside, the valley had changed, as if the world itself had been rebalanced. Snow lay softer on the pines. The aurora braided the sky in a slow, green seam that looked like a promise. The river at the valley's heart flowed with a new song. Less ledger, more lullaby, its surface catching the blood moon and turning it into a coin of light. They walked to the riverbank where the first bargain had been struck. The child she had saved, now older, cheeks flushed with cold and laughter, ran ahead and threw a handful of snow into the air. The sound was a bright thing that scattered like coins. He watched the child and then looked at her, and in that look there was everything that had been said, and everything that had been spared. No priest's ink, no ledger's seal. Only two people who had chosen one another, and, by doing so, changed the account. The rune's mark on her throat was faint, a braided line that caught the aurora's light. The mark on his palm matched it, a mirror of the vow they had made. They stood, with their hands clasped, the river at their feet, the snow at their boots, the aurora above like a seam stitched across the sky. The world had been kept and remade in a single, dangerous act of love. She leaned into him, and he held her as if the world might still be fragile. The river sang its new song, the child's laughter braided with the hush of water, and the aurora braided the sky into a slow, green seam. In the hush that followed, the ledger's teeth were quiet. The bargain had been paid in a way the river had not expected. Not with blood, but with a shared life. They walked along the river together, two figures in the snow, the seam between them a quiet, living thing. The world felt whole, in a way that had nothing to do with ledgers, and everything to do with the small, stubborn choices that make a life. Thank you for being here. I hope you enjoyed this chapter. This tale is inspired by Nordic dreams and heart. Stay close for the next chapter of this saga. With love, Claire.